and we've had some really interesting discussions on the threat modeling work group. Those meetings are recorded and published on YouTube. So if you are interested, take a look at that. Again, there's probably going to be a little bit of overlap. Specifically, probably on the behaviors would be my guess, and maybe a little bit on the architecture. But I did let the group know we were starting to talk a little bit about categories of things. And I know, Jeff, last time we met, you started that Google Sheet where we're starting to capture some of those categories, which I think is great. I talked to, let me get my German out. I talked to Kim Wutz earlier this week. She's the privacy expert, creator of Linden. And she's also going to start thinking about categories of things, obviously from a privacy perspective. So I think that's good. Where did the group want to start today? I know we proposed, like last time we proposed, well, maybe we can mock some stuff out, or we go down the category route and start fleshing some of those things out. Where does the group want to start today?
I posted some comments on the use cases. Like I wrote down like what I think the right set of use cases is, and might be worth just making sure we've got all the right use cases identified before we go, too far down the road of investing in the scheme itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I also added some things I just sort of started on that spreadsheet you set up. So I put a few things in there, but it's certainly not intended to be exhaustive.
Yeah. It looked like a stream of consciousness, but it's an organized stream of consciousness, which is good.
Yeah, I started adding. I saw the things that were there, and I'm like, okay, well, what about that? Like, I was starting to add things like more
Yeah.
classes of things.
Yeah, no, it's all good. It's starting to actually become like a real list of things.
A real list of things,
Right.
things and stuff, and
Yeah. Precisely. Let's share my screen. Blueprints. Okay. Killer use cases. Oh, we got a new section for killer use cases. I don't know who that was.
anonymous people.
That was me, but did I not paste them in there? I thought
There's suggestions. That doesn't look like you were logged in. If that was you, doesn't look like you were logged in at the time.
I would have sworn I put it in there in the comments. Like, oh, yeah, actually, look at that comment that says I'm more comfortable, and here's my list. I think I intended to paste that under killer use cases just to separate it from use cases.
Oh, okay.
So you can forget that heading, but this is the use cases. And I guess my only goal here was to focus on use cases that are things that people actually do. Like they're more like concrete things that we can support. The other use cases were like a little more theoretical.
Yeah, I kind of see your use cases as more like the higher level almost like roles. You have a role for vulnerability management, a role for incident, or a team of threat modeling, a team of incident response, a team of penetration testers, etc., a compliance team, etc.
Yeah.
And then I think the use cases that we were creating that's originally in the document kind of fit into your existing categories in different ways. I believe is kind of how I'm thinking about it.
I think that's fair.
Okay.
I try to think like, what would an incident responder do with a blueprint, for example? How would they leverage it?
Right,
Um,
right, 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 right.
You were starting, yeah, you were starting with, hey, this is the person who has their own goals. How do we help them with those particular goals? It's the, as a, right?
yeah,
As
exactly.
as a threat modeler, well, here's what they can do with
Mhm.
it.
Yeah.
And rather than one, it's definitely more like you can do this and this and this and this, right? It's the
Right,
individual is more um, maybe categorical, as Steve was saying. Like, hey, these are all the things that a threat modeler can do. Here's, if you're doing vulnerability management, here's the reasons why you would want one of these.
Yep.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, there's probably multiple things in threat modeling that you can do. There's probably multiple things in VM and IR that you can do. And we had started some of these here. So maybe what I'll do then is just maybe what I'll do. Did that copy or what did that do? Okay, hopefully it copied. So what I'll think I'll do then is um I'm gonna put, what should I label this? Maybe, oh wait, this is Justin. So use case. I'll just put that there. And then I'm gonna paste in the things that you had here. And then this was what? This was what, heading two? Okay. And then we can kind of um and then we can kind of go through this and kind of rearrange things so that it all kind of flows and makes sense. This will ultimately, I think a lot of these ideas and even maybe some of the content will likely end up in the authoritative guide at some point.
Mm,
Because
okay.
yeah, I mean that's
Sure.
really the how-to, right? This is the feature, but this is how we kind of not expect, but this is how we recommend you apply it. That's
Makes sense.
essentially, yeah, that's essentially what we did with the last two groups. Let's see, the one that you were on, Jeff, the
Blueprints or
attestation.
attestations. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we also did that for the C-bomb stuff as well.
Is there a reason that we skipped K3? Am I just like missing something?
I think the way that happened was I moved I had one in there that was I think I combined it with K1 but I can't
Okay.
remember exactly.
Right. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something. Like, no, like maybe these K numbers mean something in particular. Like,
Right.
No, no, no.
it's like I could be wrong. There are plenty of things I don't know.
Okay. So that's in there. We can yeah, now we can kind of go in there and um put things categorically where they need to be. Do we want to spend time doing that now, or is that something that we can do asynchronously?
I think we can do that async.
Okay. Um,
Right. Yeah. And yeah, it's funny, like in all the ASA ones, there's no like security roles in there at all. And we should probably talk about whether we want to try to go beyond security. Uh, I know, a blueprint could be used by all kinds of different roles.
right.
But I don't know, for me, I feel like where I can really be helpful is in the security area. Like those are the use
Yeah.
cases that I'm particularly interested in. So
Yeah, there's going to be some overlap. And for example, one of the things that we were talking about um, uh, during this week's threat modeling work group was the concept of data collected and data provided.
Mm,
So, you can collect like all kinds of data. And then, of course, on the privacy aspect, on the privacy side, right, from a security perspective, we look at like data as just a single type of thing, right? Like I've got, maybe an email address and, a person's name type of thing. And, that might end up being an information disclosure or whatever,
mhm.
single type of thing. And the privacy folks kind of look at it as, well, what other types of information um can you use to triangulate an individual and build up a bunch of knowledge about that target individual, right? So they look at it much more holistically than the security folks do. But then there's also the concept of data provided, because in some cases, right, we actually need to collect data and provide it to other things, right, and share that with maybe internal systems, or maybe we're sharing it with third-party marketing things, right?
Yeah. I
Um,
had this sort of under the like I think of this as part of the connections section, but it's fine to think of it as like the goes intos and the goes out ofs. But
yeah,
there's some of those connections send data, some of them receive data, some do both. Uh,
right,
I think that's what threw me off because it like when you go down to connections, it's specifically back end connections, and I'm like, but there's potentially connections out, right? It's not just internally, it's also I mean maybe that's covered in attack services, which is why I added the network connections piece.
right.
Um, but then you have
Exactly.
this
well, it could be
holistic
like
thing. Okay.
yeah, it could be initiated by the thing that actually did the collection, for example.
Right.
Yes.
Like one of my examples from this, like, PHI, right? If you're a um I don't know, like a patient monitor, you're gonna be collecting really important health information, but the goal of it is actually to send it to like the nurses station so people they can track like 10 people an entire floor with one nurse rather than having them walk around, right? And that's
Right,
that's intended. But if that data also has if that thing also has the capability of like sending it to the cloud, you want to know about that too. And that maybe attack surface, maybe backend connection. Maybe that's backend in a different way if it's going to the cloud, right?
Yeah. Uh,
And you
I'm
want to make
kind
sure that's, authenticated, et cetera. We're talking cyber.
right.
Like, think the idea of like crown jewels or the DoD likes talking about this cyber key terrain, whatever the like that kind of stuff. It's like, well, what is the thing you're really trying to protect here? And this
Right.
back into threat modeling, right? But it's also if we're doing a blueprint, we need to understand what are the defenses you need around this thing.
yeah, we probably need a more sophisticated model of entry points versus connections
Mhm.
versus yeah, like connections. Like when I think of entry points, I'm really thinking about, you know, user interfaces, like things like that. Um, whereas connections to me is like, there's so many different kinds of software. I think it's kind of hard to, what is this like if it's a e-blender? Like, uh, that
Well,
might have
I
a
connection could
think
totally
also be
usually
different set
like
of connections.
it could be like a GPS receiver, or any other thing that receives radio waves or whatever,
Yeah,
right? Any kind of input.
yeah. But you're right about who initiates the connection doesn't really matter. It's really about what direction the data is flowing. I mean, in terms of the threat model, it might matter that the connection was initiated by, a random internet person, or it's initiated by the trusted application. But
Mhm.
the direction of data flow it could be either way.
Right. But if the connection is, by something that's trusted, you still have to verify that actually, if you start assuming that, then you have all kinds of other security issues, right?
Sure, there's spoofing.
Yeah. So like having that, it kind of makes sense. Like that kind of stuff is an attack surface. You're like, hey, this is how things go, and what kind of like, you know, authentication, authorization stuff do you need to do?
Yeah, I think it just we need a more sophisticated connection model here. But yeah, and maybe it is just different entry points. I just think of like, there's a lot of difference between an application that asks for a message off of an MQ internally and publishing a website on the public internet. But really, they're both entry points, right? They both kick off a process inside the application that does something with that data and has behaviors and has access control and all that. Maybe.
Right. The risk profile is obviously going to be a lot different if you're inside a network versus outside. Um, but that's also why there's so much push for like zero trust stuff, where it's like, okay, well, even if you're inside my network, maybe I don't trust you anyway.
Yeah. Zero trust is good for like system to system stuff, but I don't see people really using that for like, authenticating their internet users. That's still in a big database somewhere with a bunch of hashes in it.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Well, how would you even do it? Who would manage the rules that say like Jeff in Starbucks can connect to Amazon.com? Like, no, nobody's doing that.
Last time last meeting, if I remember correctly, we were talking about the if we had like a classic threat model or a classic data flow diagram, the behaviors were going to be basically on the arrows, right? On the lines connecting the things. Is that what we discussed?
I think that it depends, right? If you're doing a data flow diagram, the behaviors of the probably the thing in my head, the things on the arrows are more that's the data that's being transferred, and the blocks are the individual like subsystems, and those would have behaviors in them. But I don't know that's my first impulse.
I I actually think that, like, to me, it's the string of behaviors that happens. Like, once, like, imagine you receive a request and then you do a series of things. It's those are the boxes. Like, the things that you do are the boxes. Um, and I don't actually care, if the specific layout of the components. Like, I don't really care if it's done in a library or in custom code, or if it's done in an API that's there's a remote call to. Like, some of that is kind of interesting, but that's really more structural. It's more like infrastructure. Like, I really want to focus on the application layer behaviors
Mhm.
and not.
So within this box that's on your theoretical diagram, within this box, essentially you have some behaviors that are happening, right? Is that what you're saying?
Each behavior to me is a box. So, like, there's a thread of execution. That's the arrow, the big arrow that all these boxes are on. And that thread does authentication, then it does access control, then it does some data transformation stuff, and then it sticks something in session,
Right.
and then it does some database queries. Like, those behaviors are the things that are relevant to security.
Right. I'm talking about I got it. My point was if I'm representing a microservice on a diagram,
Yep.
and that microservice, that box on the diagram theoretically is going to contain all the behaviors, which themselves will be a connection of individual behaviors. For example, authentication, authorization, etc., all the way
Yeah.
down to persistence. But all those things happen inside this microservice that you have represented as a box.
Yeah. So it's just a
Okay.
level of granularity. Like I was focusing in on a
Right.
blueprint for the microservice, or for
Right.
the web application, or for the rich client application. Like inside that is what matters to me. Between
Right.
those boxes, there's big lines that are like, this connects to this other big box. But it's the boxes inside the boxes. They're like the behaviors to me, the threads of execution.
Right. And because I'm glad you mentioned the word threads, because when I think of behaviors, I kind of think of I kind of think of representing that as a series of events, or the ability to do like parallel events with tangents, basically, kind of a linear type of thing,
Yeah.
with the ability to do parallel executions and some other stuff, right?
Yeah, it's not
And then
strictly a
bring it back.
threading model, because modern
Right.
frameworks use all kinds of threads to do promises and all kinds of stuff. But like
Right.
generally,
Conceptually,
yeah,
abstract.
generally when you look at the series of events that gets kicked off by a user action, but like something happens, and then there's a series of events that gets kicked off. Like you read a message off an MQ, and then there's a series of events that happen. Those behaviors usually are roughly linear.
So, but you're basically saying one path through the control flow graph, right? You're like, because Steve is basically talking about, hey, there's a whole potential for control flow. It goes, does this thing, and then maybe it splits. But Jeff, you're talking about, let's talk about the happy path, the path we expect things to go through.
Well, even
Is
if
that
I actually think of like
reasonable?
if you summed up all the possible control flows, that's the set of behaviors that can happen on that route.
Right.
And that's what I'm interested in. I don't really care that if I go left, then I do a SQL query, and if I go right, I'm going to do a
Right.
native command. But like at the end, I just want to add them up and go, that route does behaviors A, B, and C.
Right. So like the authentication, right? Theoretically, the application could maybe do LDAP authentication or OAuth, or it could simply look at a JOT that was asserted to it, ensure the signature and all that stuff is correct, and do authentication that way, right? But regardless of which way, which control flow is executed, authentication takes place. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Like, and
Okay.
what I do in my diagrams is like, I actually add up all the different control paths. Like I just combine them into one view.
Right.
And the ordering of events isn't strictly always correct. But like you're saying, like in most routes, you do see authentication first. And so that always comes first. And you try to keep the order as close as you can.
Right, but the difference in those orders is actually really important from a cyber perspective, right?
It can be.
Well, I mean,
Right.
if you have two paths and one is like, hey, go straight to the SQL, do a SQL query, or do authentication and then do the SQL query, that ordering is very important, right?
Yeah.
So you have to make sure like there is some sort of ordering that correlates to what actually happens.
Right. So like I look at the each individual thread executes in a certain order. And then I try to combine those threads into a graph of all the possible interesting paths that can happen. And usually it's not that complicated. Sometimes there's multiple paths through, but usually each route is pretty straightforward.
But Andrew brings up a good point, right? And I don't. Let me just ask the group. I have my own opinion, but do we want to be able to capture things that are out of order, like doing a SQL query to a and then just maybe after the fact that we've already said that yes, this person is authenticated, right? I mean, to me, that's more of a static analysis type of finding. We could theoretically integrate with Serif if we want to get down to control flow. But what is the group's kind of position on that?
I don't think we're going to be able to model the full control flow of an application in the blueprint, right? Like we have to make some concessions in order to simplify the diagram that we're talking about, because it could be massive. Like I've got applications that have got thousands of routes.
Right. Well, that was actually sort of my point. Is there has to be some simplification, but the order actually does still matter.
Yes.
Because it sounded like you were wanting to separate each individual behavior into a block, and that immediately makes me think of like, static analysis, kind of like, hey, what is this basic block, and how does it relate to things? But it actually maybe makes more sense to have here's the block with all the behaviors roughly in order of what you expect them to be, but maybe not perfect. And then
Right.
that's sort of what Steve was talking about. Here's the microservice. Here's the things that it does. Here's the connections it makes. And then you can zoom in kind of to arbitrary depth if you wanted to, get to, oh, well, now I'm actually going to go and pull in the static analysis piece. But that's not necessary at different levels of granularity.
Right. And I think if we actually again, if we have that abstract block, it sounds like we're all in agreement. First of all, we're just kind of saying it slightly different ways, but it sounds like we're all in agreement. We need a more of an abstract, simplified model, which is great. And then I think it would be really interesting though for the 1%ers that actually want to take this kind of technology to the extreme and actually go down the rabbit hole on that authentication block, for example, then providing access or providing a reference to the source code where that block can be found so that it can be analyzed, I think would be really interesting for the 1%ers that want to go down that path. And this is truly only going to be for maybe
I totally agree.
high assurance environments.
I actually think it's more than that. It's like, incident responders, pen testers. Like if you look at the use cases, like it's going to be helpful to have that, at least the option for that connection to the source.
Yeah. I think Jeff might have broke up, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry,
I mean, definitely.
you can't hear me? Oh,
I think you dropped off for a minute.
I think I had my thumb over the mic.
Oh, okay.
What I was saying is, like, a lot of the use cases, it would be really helpful to have that connection. I don't think it's just for like high assurance. And I'm a little like, I feel like what you were just talking about was like trying to collapse all the behaviors for an entire program, so that you'd say like, hey, this web application has SQL queries in it and it calls APIs and it does native processes, and like just lump all the behaviors together on like a per piece of software basis. I'm looking to take it to the next level and say, inside each piece of software, there's a bunch of, I call them routes. They're not, it's not exactly the right concept, but it's these threads of execution. And I think it's useful to know what each one of those does. Because a lot of them are really, when you actually look at the data, like a lot of them aren't interesting.
Right.
Some of them are super interesting. And like, that's where, I think we can help people focus on what to threat model.
So that brings me back to like maybe a question. So when I think of routes, I think of like endpoints, or I think of, JavaScript front ends, right? SPAs.
Yeah.
And then of course, when I think of flows, I think of either data flows or control flows. Both of those are just not the right nouns either.
Yeah.
Coming up with the right noun is I think something we need to figure
In
out.
in the APM world, they talk about spans and flows. So
Right.
a flow is a connection of spans. A span is like what happens inside an application, and flows are like the whole flow across a bunch of pieces of code. Um, that might be one concept. Like, depends on who you're talking to. Like, security folks talk in terms of like attack surface and endpoints. Uh, yeah, I don't know. It's just different communities use different words for that stuff. Security doesn't really have a good word for what goes on inside the code, which is kind of
Right.
telling.
Maybe
I mean,
that's why the OWASP top 10 really hasn't changed in 20 years.
Hey,
well, I don't know. Well, I usually think about that as like, here's the path of the control flow or something, right? But everyone, but I think it is specific to even your subset of cybersecurity, what you're going to think about.
yeah, yeah.
But I do like your point of it's not just a matter of, hey, here's all the behaviors in this subset. Maybe that's one view, and you want to like dig in and you say, okay, well now I need to know where all these things connected, and then sort of like, hey, now it's like smaller blocks and those connections between them, or like here's one path, here's another path,
Right.
here's all the various ways you need to make sure, all of the most important paths are protected, and eventually, maybe build up so all of them are actually secure, but that's probably not going to happen.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, yeah, settling on some vocabulary, I think is going to be interesting. Um,
Yeah.
okay.
You're
All
right
right. Well,
you're right about the term routes. Like people use that mostly when they're talking about sort of front end stuff.
right.
The back end things are, they're potentially just as dangerous. Like reading off of a queue is just another request that comes into your application, right?
Right.
But people don't talk about routes there. They just talk about, your how you're handling messages off the queue.
Mhm, mhm. And looking at some of these behaviors, for example, right? Uh, Theoretically, I mean, um, we could have like a behavior where, maybe input is coming into an application. It is being um, collected. I don't see anything here for processing. I mean, we've got batch jobs and stuff like that, but just general processing. And then I don't see anything in here for persisting. There's database, but that's a kind of persistence. Um, so I kind of see these things like all kind of like one going to the next type of thing. Um, okay. So sounds to me that we almost need to figure out what that noun is going to be. What are we going to call these things? And then spend a little bit of time on the behaviors themselves. When we define these behaviors, when we define this taxonomy of things, we do have to provide a formal definition of what these things mean. Because it is an international standard, right? So it's ultimately this ends up in a PDF somewhere. So we're gonna have to define what all these things mean,
PDF somewhere.
right? Well, it's on
Does
the
it,
ECMO website. That's where
right?
it is. Um, but it also ends up in a JSON documentation and stuff like that, so people actually know what it is that we're referring to. Like,
Yep.
what exactly is a host interaction, for example? I don't know. We would have to define that.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah,
know.
I put that in as sort of a catch-all of like, hey, this is how it
Right.
like is actually interacting with the host operating system. Like, hey, it's reading files, it's writing files. Because that didn't
Okay.
seem exactly anywhere else.
Well, it's better
So
than
I was
an
trying
other.
to right, exactly. So it's just like, well, I have ideas of what that means, right? It could be
Mhm.
I was thinking of this as like classes of kinds of behaviors
Right,
your
right,
thing's
right,
gonna do.
right.
Because
Yeah.
part of it is like, hey, you're you're making it so it's now going to, you know, set up a cron job, so it's gonna run again. I mean, do
Mhm.
you care about that? Maybe you do, maybe you do. I don't know. That's
Right.
persistence in the other way, where it's like this thing is going to persist for forever,
Mhm,
not
mhm.
necessarily persisting in data.
Yeah, I think we should
Right.
try to capture these in terms of like, you know, how the software would think about them. Like this is uh invoking an operating system command or uh like reading an environment variable, that kind of stuff.
Right. I wasn't sure if that was going to be too low level. Because those are certainly like things I was thinking about in
Yeah, we're gonna have to choose
that
our level
framework.
here pretty carefully, right? Like you don't want
Yeah.
thousands of possible things because then it's impossible to write policy about them, but you don't
Right.
want like four either. It's not
Right.
descriptive enough. So I don't know where it's like in between there somewhere is like the right level of granularity.
Mhm. Right.
I actually kind of think of invoking the operating system. I kind of think of it almost like a connect. It's almost
You mute, you muted yourself, but yeah, it's another connection some way,
yeah,
right?
yeah. It's like uh, it's almost an external system to what the code that you're actually writing. So it's a separate process.
Yeah. I mean, there's plenty of organizations that, I mean, they've got like one team, and that team like manages the application, the operating system, and on a, and whatnot. And then there's other organizations that, your application team doesn't trust your operating system team, and vice versa, right? One team manages one, and the other manages the other, and you have, separation of duties and that sort of thing.
Right.
So I don't think there's one right answer, right? But if we can model, if we have the ability to model both, I think that would be great. Um, um, so
Yeah.
where do we want to, how do we want to tackle the taxonomy? We've been doing this async. Do we want to spend some time? Is this the first of all, do we want to, are these top level categories the things that we actually want? Attack surface, defenses, risky behaviors, connections. Oh, it's like Jeff's
Recording progress.
This will.
Jeff.
I'm on my desktop now. This will be easier for me. Um,
Okay.
yeah,
I was asking, is it top level categories? Are those the things that we want? Is there more? Is there less? Do we want to keep these names?
yeah. No, this is what I've found these categories to be pretty useful in my experimenting with trying to build blueprints. Um, but it's just sort of the security view.
Mhm.
Like I found this to be pretty expressive. When I want to express the behavior of a chunk of code, I can break it down into routes and then say, what does each route do? And I just, you can just put these behaviors on that route. I'm gonna use that term route until we decide on something better. We can just put those
Mhm,
behaviors
mhm.
on that route and everything, like it makes sense.
Okay.
But it's not, I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about other fields of endeavor, like where they might want a blueprint. Like this is just a security view.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
I think back to something Steve said earlier, there's nothing about really processing the data. And that's
Yeah.
that's the core of most applications. It's not getting the data, it's not sharing the data. It's like, okay, what is this thing actually going to do with that data?
Yeah.
How is it
Right.
going to
And
manipulate it?
yeah, and depending on the regulation that you're looking at, processing data might actually mean something.
Right.
Hmm.
Right. Are we? Right.
I don't think we need
Whether
to
you're
model like what kind of processing, because that's just going to be a rabbit hole we'll never, escape
right.
from. But we, even in a traditional, like stride-based threat model, you typically have a circle that represents a process. Now that could be a running process. It could be a process that's running on data that you're getting from an application. It doesn't really matter. It depends on how you're modeling it. But yeah, they have the concept of just a generic process. Um,
Yeah,
Yeah.
like when I think about it, each one of those routes is essentially a separate process, right? Like it takes a certain kind of request, it does a certain kind of things and has a certain kind of result. The fact that it's all actually running inside one big process doesn't really matter.
No, but I'm saying like, from a PII perspective, right? There's a big difference between like tying authentication, authorization, input validation. I'm just thinking of a traditional input path. So you
Yeah,
authorize, you authenticate, you authorize, maybe you do some input validation, and you store it.
I know, but
Well,
other than sorry, go ahead.
if you had something before the storage, like a process, you're processing that data and it's PII. Well, that actually means something now because policy.
Yeah, I'm struggling to think of like how we would make subcategories of processing, right? Like you
That's
could
why I said I think that's a rabbit
storage,
hole we don't want to go
that's it.
down.
Right, right, right.
But just the fact that you're doing something, for example, you are processing data, you're persisting data. A database might be where you're persisting it, or might be a file system or whatever. But you're persisting data, you're processing data, you're capturing data, you're
Yeah. You could sort
Yeah.
out, I guess, a number of those risky behaviors. You could sort those into some other categories, right? Like the ones you're mentioning.
okay.
But I think his
Um,
point is have literally a catch-all behavior of like, we've gathered all this data, now we're going to process it. We're not going to necessarily tell you exactly what that we don't have to enumerate all the ways you can process data because it's infinite, right?
Yeah, no,
right.
just in my head, I try to stick to things that you can detect automatically. And I think that's a little vague, right? Like, I don't know. I got a whole bunch of records and I did some string operations and I did some like, I don't know how you detect whether it qualifies as processing or not.
There actually are some ways of doing that.
Yeah.
Um, some of them we do ourselves actually automatically. But either way, um, I think the point isn't to get into the details of, hey, this is what it actually is, but more from the use cases on compliance, right? There's going to be a lot of compliance factors based on, hey, now we're doing, processing in quotes, right?
Right. Yeah.
I wonder if we could, if we have to push this much farther, like, I think we should, make, just push it a little farther and, develop these, define them and all that, but like, can we make it extensible in some way that we can just like version one is just like, okay, we're supporting the basics and we're going to refine this taxonomy more in version two? Or is it really important to get these first ones right?
I think it's important to get the structure right.
Yeah,
And it's important to be able, in my opinion, to be able to model any kind of generic behavior, as well as the majority of security specific behaviors.
Yeah.
I think in my mind that's important, as well as allowing people to extend it, and we will extend it over time, right? We will add to it, but that's why um, the taxonomy itself, the structure of it, needs to be pretty solid, because we can't, once it's done, we can't really change the structure of it.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, like I think we need a richer way. Like the biggest problem I see here is the notion of connections is, this is like back end, this is sort of like front end, but it's not really sophisticated enough, I think.
No, and we could just like remove the back end, because I know plenty of front ends that connect directly to APIs, for example. Most spas, that's how they operate.
Yeah, yeah, but it's actually a back end connection for the front end, right? Like the front
Right,
end.
but that's a different component on your model, though. I mean, for example, if you've got different things, you might have a box for the front end communicating to the box on the back end. Well, your behaviors on the front end box, those can all be modeled. One of the behaviors is going to be, an API call to the back end, and then your back end is also going to have, a bunch of behaviors, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's what we should probably make it sort of pluggable. Like there's an API inbound and an API
Right, right,
response,
right, right,
like
right.
so that it doesn't matter where in the diagram they fit, it's still the same thing, as long as it's somebody connecting to an API that's got one kind of model, and getting results back from an API is another. Whether it's the front end and somebody's accessing the API directly, or if it's a back end and it's, some internal piece of code accessing that API, shouldn't matter for purposes of the blueprint.
Right, right. Um, Now for things like database and email, um, I'm thinking that instead of having database and email, we provide a way for you to say, um, like for database, for example, persist, and then you can um, supply, for example, the if you're persisting, well, what are you like? What is the it's not language. What is the um I'm at a loss for nouns right now. But is
Method
it is it
type of
SQL? Is it
persistence.
GraphQL? Is it raw storage?
Hmm.
Right? And then maybe even supply optionally the port. That way, instead of having a thing that says database, you could reuse the thing called persist, and then you could supply the GraphQL, SQL, raw storage, whatever, as well as the optional port. That's going to give you a lot more granularity out of a generic type of persist. Email, if you decompose what email is, it's essentially an outbound connection on a specific port. And that's nothing specific to email, because you could theoretically have a outbound connection for, SSH and for a bunch of other things as well. So I don't necessarily know if we want to capture the services themselves. I think maybe we can
Hmm.
describe like a connection to a service, and then optionally provide like the port numbers, or whatever the protocol.
Yeah,
I think that makes a lot of sense to have like higher level generic versions of behaviors and then allowing depth if necessary,
Right.
because it's easier to reason about, hey, you know, incoming connection, data coming in, persisting it, processing, send it back out again. Well, was there any authentication in there? Well, okay, well, I got to add that in there, right?
Right. Right. Right.
Yeah.
And in
And not
some
even getting
cases,
specific of authentication, right? It's like we have authentication, here's the details of it, but the rationalization, or I guess the reasoning about it, it's easier at a higher level.
yeah, I'm also thinking about some automation use cases where, I mean, runtime is one thing. You're going to be able to observe the stacks trace, so it's probably less important for runtime analysis. But if you're delivering, say for example, you're a software vendor and you're supplying the behavior of what your application does. Well, maybe like a lot of enterprise applications, it's going to be infinitely configurable. And how the customer configures to persist something. For example, do they want to store it into the file system or an S3 bucket? Because either is possible. So in that case, I might want to just say, well, I persist stuff and I don't know how it's done because it is a configurable thing.
Yeah. I was thinking, we could define these categories, like an attribute could be whether it's inbound, outbound, or both.
Right. Right.
And then, every one of these connections has details, right? There's like, file names and that protocols and ports and authentication and encryption and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But that's probably a better way to model it than rather than trying to say like everything in the service table.
Right. Right. Right.
I like that.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, even queues, we could have some attributes around like whether they're transient or persistent, stuff like that.
Right. 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 That also matters from a policy perspective.
Yeah.
Are you storing the data or not? Or is it transient?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we could come up with a scheme that has it's actually interesting. It's like instead of trying to list a bunch of services, we could just have like a generic connection, but it's got all these attributes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we could probably detect that. Like some of them are obvious, and we should put like it should have a name or a name or a type kind of thing that says, hey, this is a SFTP connection,
Right. Right. Right.
and here's what I'm using it for. Yeah. One thing I didn't, and like type of data is really important, right?
Data type. Yeah, absolutely.
But it's kind of obscured if you just say it's an API call. Like, I don't know, it could be all credit card numbers.
Right. And that's one of the things that Kim Woods is also working on.
Yeah.
She's going to be coming up with a certainly not certainly not a complete taxonomy, but she's going to be starting work on a taxonomy of different types of data, not data classifications, because as we all know, that's very organizational or industry specific, but the type of data itself, which is a different type of thing. So she's going to come up with a taxonomy. There doesn't seem to be a central taxonomy for that, which is really, really interesting. There's different silos of different things, but she's going to be looking at some of these different silos and seeing if she can come up with a standardized taxonomy for types of data. So we'll eventually be able to then reuse, once she does that, and again, that's part of the threat modeling group, we'll be able to then reuse that here is kind of the goal.
Yeah. Should we move all these things that are under attack surface down to connections, or most of them?
Well, yeah, well, maybe because your attack surface is basically going to be anything that accepts an inbound. Oh, that's the thing too. A connection we can't just describe whether or not it's inbound or outbound. We actually need to describe whether or not it is listening, whether it has the potential to accept inbound connections, because that's essentially your attack surface, right?
Right.
Well, I mean, at least
Well,
your,
no,
I
actually,
guess your external.
anything that,
Right. Your external one, right?
anything that's accepting data, even if you initiate the connection, is still attack surface.
Mm-hmm.
But the knowing that it's listening is interesting for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you
Because it could be a
knowing if
radio
it's listening is
signal,
down
right?
there. Oh, also true.
Yeah. Let's think about that combined. All right, I better jump.
All right.
Yeah, 3 o'clock.
Good. If I get motivated, I'll think about this a little more over the next week.
Get motivated, Jeff.
I,
All right. Cheers. Have a great weekend.
you guys.
All right,
All right. Bye-bye.
everybody.